Hi there, I am Alicia Shepard, founder of Nucleus Commercial Real Estate Training, one of the CEO and partners of Launch Commercial Real Estate Services, and a KW MAPS commercial coach. And I'm here today to talk through with you the art form of pricing and underwriting commercial real estate, especially when the market is in what we call a shift, when the market is doing something different than maybe we're used to. See, many of us, if you've been in the industry for 10 years or less, have only seen upward facing markets until these last 12 months. And now that we're in a market that is getting more complicated, that is downward facing, where we're feeling the gap between the expectations of a seller and the expectations of a buyer when looking at a commercial real estate asset, we have to get really great at the art form of underwriting. Now, you might say commercial real estate is black and white. The numbers are the numbers. There's no art form to it. But any seasoned veteran in the industry is going to tell you that the art form is actually where our value is able to come to the table for our clients. It's where we're able to stop wasting our time, energy, and efforts on deals and transactions that we can't make stick. Maybe we did a lot of work, put a ton of time, got it under contract, and then everything fell apart. And it's where we're able to actually create the market around in the investment properties that we work with, because our pricing has a strategy to it. Our pricing has intelligence to it. And most importantly, our pricing has a deep understanding of the asset we're looking at, the market that we're in, and the phase of the market cycle that we are taking this property out to the buyer community with. So today I'm going to take you through 10 core moments that we need to pause and really develop our skills in as commercial real estate practitioners to create an art form around our pricing strategy. Instead of it just being a quick glance of here's the average cap rate, here's the average price per square foot. If you're in multifamily, maybe here's the GRM that is important to the investor community right now. We're going to look at some different things that help you maybe stretch the pricing a little bit, maybe create the narrative and the understanding of why we could close this gap between buyers and sellers. I'm going to give you the 10 topics right out the gate, and then we'll go into depth with each of them. We're going to first talk about location analysis, and then we'll shift into property type and use. After that, we'll look at financial performance, comparable sales, which that's kind of what we're probably using at a high level now, right? Tenant analysis, physical condition, market conditions, financing options, risk assessment, and investment returns. As we go through these 10, I want you to keep an open mind. Maybe you've been underwriting commercial real estate for a long time. I've been doing this for 17 years and I can still look up and learn something new every single day. So I'd like you to make sure that you're not just a prisoner to this training, but that you're coming in as a true explorer, and you're going to learn something new out of this, because chances are there's something in this art form that maybe you're not touching right now. I'm also going to ask that as I explain new trends and tactics, if there's something you leave this with a question on, jump into the comments or reach out to me and let me know what those are. I'm happy to help develop your understanding around this art form and this technique. So let's dig in. We're going to start with location analysis. When I'm looking at a commercial real estate asset, the location analysis is where I'm going to really get that bird's eye view as well as an in-depth view of the community that's in. The bird's eye view is probably going to take me into market trends. This is where I need to understand the current and projected trends of the area. In a market like I work in Los Angeles, gentrification is a very real thing that happens. And I had someone this week ask, well, what does that word mean? Because it hadn't hit their market. Gentrification is when we are seeing the path of progress, the path of development, the path of new tenant energy, new projects from the city, new developments coming in and shifting the narrative and the identity of a community. So if I'm working with a piece of real estate and it's sitting inside a community that is either bordered by or is already impacted by or totally not touching a gentrified path, I'm going to understand that. And I'm going to look at it and say, in today's world, that creates this, fill in the blank, impact on the property. And in the next 3, 5, 10 years, here's what we project seeing happening. And you say, Alicia, how on earth could I guess what's coming 10 years from now? Well, part of my job, part of where I add value to my clients, and you can too, is that we go understand what are the city's plans or the community. If you're in a tertiary market, what are the county's plans, the state's plans, perhaps, that could impact this asset based on the trends and the projects that are coming into this community. That market trend study is where you're going to get a finger touch feel for what is happening in the evolution of the community that surrounds this property. Now, once I understand that, now I can look at accessibility. Accessibility, when I'm thinking about location analysis, is going to be the proximity around transportation, amenities, major highways, big employers. In some locations, like in Orlando or in Anaheim, where there's Disney, it might even include things like tourist attractions. If you're in an urban area like Manhattan or Los Angeles, you're going to think about accessibility also for how long will it take me to get through traffic to get there, right? As I think about accessibility, I'm looking for ingress and egress. That's where there's inflow to the property and outflow from the property. Does it put me onto a feeder road or a service road that's going to make it difficult for traffic to actually get here? Great example of that. I go to Lifetime Fitness here in Austin, where I live these days. And at that Lifetime, when I exit the freeway to get to it, and it's the only exit that's accessible to it, I am about 20 feet past where the last driveway for that gym is. So I have to go all the way around, loop underneath the freeway because there's a green belt, so it dead ends, and then come back to get into Lifetime. It adds an additional 4 minutes on the just journey of getting to the gym. And that's true for everybody that goes to that gym because that's the only way I can get to it. The ingress and egress is a disadvantage to that property. Now, when I'm pricing that property, knowing that absolutely will impact the way that I price the building. Because if I didn't look at that while working on it and I start pricing the building and I overshoot what the pricing capability is because I didn't pay attention to this, I don't consider something that a buyer or an investor is going to look at, or even a tenant is going to look at and say, that's a little bit of a like downgrade for us. That's something that we look at and we strip away a little bit of value. If I didn't consider it and they did, I'm overpriced. I'm the reason that the gap happened between the seller and the investor, or the landlord and the tenant. And so accessibility is a really important thing for us to look at. How easy is it to get to this property? You also, when you think about accessibility, want to think about the vendor uses that might tether to it. If I'm looking at, let's say, an industrial park, are 18-wheelers that are coming with shipments going to be able to easily access it? Because that'll make a difference in who the tenants are, how long the leases I can get are, and that will impact, therefore, both the price that the owner of the building would be able to command for it and the lease value that tenants would put on top of it. Accessibility is really important. So when I think about location analysis, I'm going to look at big picture. How will the environment that this property is sitting in, that this location is in, because real estate's location, 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 how will the community and environment it sits in impact it today, in the near future, and in the distant future? And I'm also going to think about accessibility. When I think through the lens of market trends and accessibility, I've already put one of the largest brushstrokes of this artistry into place, because that's going to help me be well educated on the potential of this property. Now we can move into property type and use. This is our second piece in our, if you think of it almost like a toolkit. Our artists call it their atelier. In our toolkit of how I'm going to price property. Property type and use is where I'm going to look at the benefits and the hindrances potentially of the actual sticks and bricks that are on top of this real estate. Do the improvements, which if I go to a real estate vernacular, improvement is anything that's been put on top of the dirt. Do the improvements drive value or do they hinder it? To first look at that, I'm going to look at zoning laws. I'm going to make sure that the property is complying with local zoning regulations as it is today, because the worst thing I could do is price it and then the buyers come and tell me, hey, did you know this property is actually not compliant? Because they can't get debt on it if it's not compliant. Oops. I'm going to make sure that these zoning laws are compliant today. And I'm going to look at, do the zoning laws empower this building to be its highest and best use? Or is there a zoning overlay? Is there a new zoning capability? Does the buildable potential of the zoning on this property maybe command that the higher and best use would be something other than the real estate that exists today? That could mean that there's a potential of an addition onto the development that's there right now, or a total tear down and a redevelop. Now, when I look at that, and I'm an urban infill development specialist, when I look at that, I know that I've got to get real clarity around how that impacts the price today, because I might be pricing it based on the improvements, based on the current revenue. But if I look and say the zoning actually gives us more power to build something bigger here, now I've got to go into residual land analysis. Now I got to think through the lens of a developer. And more times than not, we see land that sits on the market, and brokers justify poor pricing by saying land just takes a long time to sell. Land priced incorrectly takes a long time to sell. Land that's priced correctly based on the potential of the dirt and that doesn't try to reward the current owner for future development potential, that's land that transacts. And I've got to have my skills really sharpened around property type and use so that when I'm looking at any piece of inventory and I say, this kind of feels like a big lot for this size property, or this property is really old and maybe it's got income and deferred maintenance issues, the zoning might be where I can drive value that doesn't exist today. And the zoning might also be where I've got a hindrance that if I didn't pay attention to, I'm going to be overpriced on this asset. So make sure that when you're pricing an asset, we think about property type and use. That's going to be both looking at zoning laws and considering potential use. Third, I'm going to go into financial performance. Now, this is where the contracts that are tethered to the property today, its current behavior, are going to be how I get to exceptional pricing. When I look at financial performance, there's the income statement, and I'm going to put that in consideration and in balance with the expenses on the property. To do this, I need to make sure that I'm not using a cocktail napkin approach to evaluate this. I don't just kind of spitball the numbers. I need in-depth underwriting. And that means I'm going to get a really thorough analysis of all of the income streams that come in on the property. Probably not going to underwrite that income on a high pro forma basis in a shifted market. In an upward facing market, lenders sometimes will consider the potential future income that a new operator could bring. In a downward facing market, most lenders and most banks are going to be pretty conservative on that. So I'm going to be really gentle with how I use the language of pro forma. Had a colleague, John Laterno, he's very active with NAR and a commercial dominant force up in the Chicago market. He said one time, pro forma is Latin for the agent made it up. And I think that there's real truth in that when I'm thinking about the artistry around underwriting a piece of real estate. If I'm having to drive value and justify a purchase price on income that's not captured yet, that's my lazy approach to the owner said they wanted 5 million, and I guess I should just figure out how to make this sell at 5 million because I'm desperate for a listing. Don't be that agent. That's not how we want to underwrite this property. We'll never sell it. And your brand will get tethered to overpricing based on pro forma, and that's Latin, or the owner made it up. That full credit, John Laterno, for that one. When I'm looking at the income, I also want to be really thorough. I need to see a full rent roll. I need to look at the actual leases so that I see documented income. I might even do estoppels if the landlord maybe has some gap in their paperwork to document the income that's coming in on the property. An estoppel certificate is just where you give a worksheet, if you will, a form to the tenant to fill out in their own vernacular or in their own language. This is what I pay, and these are the terms of my rent, and to bring it back in. And I'm also going to look at probably a P&L to make sure that the income that the leases says are coming in actually is coming in on the property, because a buyer is going to do this analysis as well. An investor's going to do this deep dive. If I take a property to the market and I haven't done my homework to verify that the income is actual and the income is truly happening, the income is contractual, the buyer will, and then they'll say, Alicia, you overpriced this property. There's no way we can pay that price. Why didn't you do your homework? It's my job to do that. It's your job too. I might also look at additional income streams. I want to make sure and ask the owner of the property, is there any billboard revenue, cell tower revenue? Is there any EV charging revenue, storage revenue, pet deposit revenue, CAM that's coming in? Anything that's sitting on top of this property, I need to make sure I'm aware of and I'm accounting for in my income. Now, some of those more creative ways of creating revenue that aren't just the traditional lease, a bank might put a little bit of an asterisk on it. So you want to make sure if the owner is gathering additional income streams, that you're going back and finding the paperwork with them to justify that. The next side of it is with the expenses. I want to make sure my expenses are in line with the market. I want to stress test insurance. I want to make sure I'm underwriting taxes for the new owner, not based on the taxes the current owner paid. And this is where I see young commercial agents get it wrong, or green commercial brokers, someone that maybe this is the first or second commercial asset they're playing with. They'll underwrite the taxes based on whatever the owner said or showed them, like, these are the taxes I pay on the property. But if the owner is paying taxes based on what they purchased the property for, a new owner may have extremely different taxes. So you need to know what your tax code from your local governing entity says is going to be deployed on that property and how that works, and then underwrite that based on the price that you're asking a new buyer to pay. In financial performance with expenses, I'm also going to look at things like what does the trash take to pick up? What is the going rate for that in my market? Repairs and maintenance, marketing. If you're hearing all these things and you're like, Alicia, this is too vague, I need a full list, I'd encourage you to come join us in Nucleus. We have a full 80-hour curriculum available for commercial real estate agents or someone just getting into commercial real estate. You can jump into that and get a full backbone knowledge around commercial real estate. It's at nucleuscre.com. I'd invite you to check it out. So when I'm looking at those expenses, I want to stress test them. I'm going to actually go back to my P&L. I'd like to see a full 2 years of P&Ls. Let's say, we're sitting in July today. I might see this year's year to date, but I want to see all of last year's, right? That way I can see a full year, and I can look for anywhere where maybe there's some expenses that seem like it's too high or it's too low. And I'm going to get that in there. I'm going to use some market knowledge. I'm going to study other packages in my market if you're a newer agent so that I can understand what trends are following. And I'm going to make sure that I've got expenses that I can look back at. 24 months probably of utility bills super helpful so that I can actually compare. Are they paying the utilities? Are there trends in the utilities? Maybe I look at it and in July the water is like crazy high and I can see, well, actually there's, extra watering that's happening on the landscape areas of the property. Or I could look up and see that the electric is much higher in one month than another. The gas is much higher. I'm just going to look for trends and be able to go back to the owner and ask, why are those there? And then I can also annualize those expenses. So get really in the weeds. This is where we got to put on like our murder she wrote hat, and we are asking questions and diving into everything. Now, once I've got income really under control, I also need to look at vacancy and occupancy rates. This is going to be where I make sure that I understand how banks are going to underwrite it. So you may say, Alicia, I don't need to look at vacancy. It's 100% full. Yes. However, lenders in the commercial space always assume a certain percentage of vacancy per year on any property, and they cushion that in so that they're not out and overestimating what the net revenue on a property is going to be. So we have to do that in our underwriting too. Now, the fastest way to accelerate your knowledge around the financial performance and to spot check, did you get it right, is to have a great lending relationship. Someone who's a commercial loan broker that you can come back to and say, show you my underwriting. Can you tell me what kind of debt I could put on top of this? Because that debt is going to be an important part of the financial performance of the property. I need to know what kind of debt a buyer would have access to. And that's going to help make sure that I also am not overpriced. A great lender, mine's Chris Wazell. He works with us at Launch Capital Corporation Markets. And as we look at properties and we're pricing those, he's able to come back and give us within 48 hours, 5 to 10 quotes. Here's what different banks are going to look at this as. Here's where maybe your pricing strategy needs to be based on the debt that a buyer could acquire. And we can put that into our packaging, right? You can go to launchcre.com and check out our Capital Corp products. A guy like Chris, if you don't have a great lender, can help make sure that you're looking at the debt scenario and that you're getting things like your expense estimations, the way you're looking at income and your occupancy rates correct whenever you're doing that financial performance artistry with your underwriting. So to recap that with financial performance, we're looking at income statement and we're also looking at occupancy rate. And a relationship with a great lender is going to ensure that I get those right and I look at it through the same lens that a lender is going to look at it through. Now, once I get there, we go into the fourth one, which is comparable sales. And this is where most agents start and unfortunately stop their underwriting process. They might look at the income and financial components, and that's definitely there, but then they just go, okay, let's look at this against a comparable market, period, end of statement, I'm done underwriting. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one because most of us should have this one under our control. I will give you a few tactics on how I think about this one though. So when I'm looking at comparable data, I want to look at it both for the sales and the rentals of this property. When I'm putting together underwriting on a property, I love a rule of 5, 5, and 5. So I'm going to look for 5 sold properties that give me some justification around my price. I'm going to look for 5 that are under contract that show me based on where they were at market, where they might be under contract at, and I'm gonna look for 5 currently listed. Now that's going to show me a historic trend of where pricing is moving in this market. And when I have those 5, some of them may be justifying my price and some of them may be to expose what happens when a property is mispriced. So when I'm looking at that listed property, I'm probably going to pull one that's been on the market way too long that has overstretched pricing to show the seller the reality of what happens if we price too high. But when I look at recent transactions, I'm really looking, for similar properties, similar in age. I might go 20 years younger, 20 years above. Depends on your market and what construction trends followed. And I'm going to look for properties that are similar in size, similar in use. And that's going to be who I want in this collection of 5, 5, and 5. And you say, Alicia, the market's been dry. If you're in a market like Portland and they only did 43 apartment transactions last year, you look up and you go, that's kind of hard to pull a 5, 5, 5 model on. And it might be. Less is okay, but I don't want to go more than 5, right? And when there is, let's say, a desert of comparable data, knowing that and being able to go back to the seller and say, in the last 6 months, there's only been one comparable property that traded. So we really have to rely on some of the other conditions that I'm teaching you today to justify our pricing and to coach our seller around what that pricing should be. So I'm going to look at recent transactions. Price per square foot and cap rate are some big ones that people hit on. Know what in your product type are the metrics that the builders, that buyers, and investors look at that is probably going to be their biggest focal point to catch their attention, right? So you might say mine's price per square foot and price per unit if I'm apartment buildings. If it's industrial, it's maybe price per square foot of the lot, and cap rate. So just know what those metrics are for you so you can really nail those when you're pulling comparable data. The fifth one is tenant analysis. Now that is looking at a property that has tenants. This multifamily is probably on the shelf for this one because I've got to follow fair housing rules on that. But when I look at office, industrial, retail, even any triple net assets, even hotels, hospitality, when I look at tenant analysis, I'm checking for the credit worthiness. I want to evaluate the financial stability of the current tenants that are in this property, the financial attractiveness of the current tenants that are in this property. And I want to be able to have a narrative of why these tenants add or decrease from the value of the property. Now, when I'm taking it to the seller, this is my defense panel, right? I've got to be able to share why the tenants that are here drove or brought down my pricing. When I take it out to the market, once seller and I are in agreement of price and terms, then I take it out to the market. I've got to be able to then craft the narrative of we priced our property based on these tenants, and here are the benchmarks you need to understand as a new investor or a new buyer on this property. I'm also going to look at the lease terms. The length of a lease makes a massive difference in what the value of the property would be. You might have Amazon or Starbucks in as a tenant on a property, but if they only have a year or two left on that, that's going to absolutely bring down the value. Now, if I've got 10, 15 years left on a 20-year lease, awesome. That's going to drive value. That gives security to someone that's looking for a long-term hold and that they're not going to have to really put a lot of legwork in. They want that mailbox money on a long-term lease, right? So we look at the terms of the lease. That might be length. That might be options at the end of the lease. You want to consider these things and really understand the lease. So if you're underwriting, but you haven't gathered the leases from the owner to really understand the terms of that lease, you've skipped a really important step that is going to absolutely leave you blind around the pricing you're putting on top of property. You have to get those leases. You have to know what they say, and you have to know how they impact the revenue of the property today, because we're not going to perform it, right? We know what the revenue is today. And based on the term of those leases, we also can say from a point of fact, the leases dictate that in year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, year 10, year 20, these are the terms of the property. These are the conditions under which these tenants are in relationship with that property. You got to be able to articulate that. Otherwise, you're just another real estate agent that's playing the commercial space versus being a professional commercial real estate broker or agent. Now I can go into the pieces that are a little bit more tangible, a little less of I've got to have deep knowledge or look outward. I can move into physical condition. When I'm looking at underwriting a property, the physical condition is so important. I need to understand if this property, if the sticks and the bricks, if you will, are going to be something that have been well cared for and that a buyer looks at and doesn't see a large maintenance issue on their hands or a large like repositioning strategy on their hands. In an upward facing market, buyers love that stuff. They want to get their hands dirty because they're going to capture the upside. They're hoping that they're buying here and they're going to be able to sell up here, right? They want to capture that upside of doing the work. There's some meat on the bone that they can go get. A downward facing market, they have to hold for a while. That real estate cycle could take us anywhere from 10 to 11 years to get from the downward that we're in back to an equivalent upward swing. And so that strategy isn't one that buyers really love right now. They don't want to come in and have to do a heavy lift. Most of the buyers today are buying out of need, not out of opportunity. And so that physical condition of the property is important for me to not only witness and take into consideration my pricing, but to be able to talk about. And so in the market we're in today, I highly recommend go get a property inspection. If your seller's not going to pay for it, you pay for it, because that's going to be part of the investment that you're bringing to the table to say, I'm going to get this deal done. By conducting a thorough inspection, you can identify any maintenance issues that you need to know are going to be capital improvements a new buyer has to make on a property. Now, when I'm doing that inspection, I might come into one of the D's. D's are a reason people sell, right? D's are the factors that make people raise their hand and say, I can't deal with this property anymore. I need someone else to come take it off my hands. And that's deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance is when the condition of the property has depleted. And for it to maintain its integrity, to maintain its ability to capture revenue at the pace that it has potential to, we need to fix these things. So when I'm underwriting a property, I'm going to look at the deferred maintenance. I may go get some quotes. Let's say that property inspection comes back and it says, man, this roof, they need a new roof on this industrial building. Great. I'm going to get a quote on that. And that quote is going to be part of my defense to the seller around what our pricing strategy needs to be. That quote and that information is going to be part of what I disclose to a buyer, saying we've already taken into consideration in our pricing. The quote says the new roof is going to cost you 25 grand. We took 25 grand off the potential price of this property. We're selling it in the condition it is, but here's your lift that you might need to do on this property when you purchase it. Some sellers may opt to do the work themselves, but in a downward facing market, I rarely recommend that because they may not recapture the full value of the investment they made. They may put 25 grand into replacing that roof, but by the time we got it done, there was another shift in rates or another shift in buyer confidence in the market, another economic change that just dropped us a little bit further down. They may not capture that full investment that they made, and I want to protect them from that. So when I'm looking at physical condition, I'm going to get a property inspection when and where possible. I'm going to get my eyes on the building. I'm going to take photo evidence of what's happening. I'm going to look at the parking lot, at the condition of the foundation, at the sticks and the bricks that rise it up. I'm going to look at that roof. I'm going to look at plumbing and sewer. A thorough property inspection makes all of this very easy, so I don't have to become an expert that's like crawling around in a property. Try to avoid that as a commercial agent. Our suits don't look cute when we do that. But with deferred maintenance, if in that property condition inspection, I come across deferred maintenance, I'm going to go get quotes and I'm going to be able to defend that in my property underwriting. Now I'm going to move on to market conditions. This is where comparable data many agents look at, but they don't go the next step and say, but what are the market conditions that are impacting this that I need to understand? See, this is where pricing becomes a little bit of a chess strategy. I've got to be able to predict what's coming next, what the next move the market's going to take, and how that will impact. There's two big ones that I think about here versus supply and demand. As I'm sitting here in the summer of 2024, many markets have supply issues. I hear from the agents that I coach, the thousands of agents that are involved through Nucleus or through Launch or through KW Commercial. We hear a very large microphone or megaphone saying there's not enough inventory on the market. And the truth is, there actually is enough inventory in the market. The stuff that's priced well is moving like that. You want to be the agent that controls that inventory, and the stuff that's not just sits stale and it hangs out there. And there's not a lot of that there because many sellers, if they don't have a real D that's driving them to go be a seller, they're staying on the sidelines. So market supply and demand is going to be really important. You need to understand, and I need to understand in my market, how that supply and demand dynamic is currently functioning. So I might use a tool like CoStar or anything that has comp stacking in it. I might use CompStack or Crexi to go look at the market dynamics of supply and demand and be able to tell that narrative around my property. If I know there's limited supply, I know there's limited inventory, that might give me the ability to stretch a little bit on my pricing, but I don't want to get too high so that I'm one of those properties that's sitting on the market more than 90 days. I want to really make sure that I'm pricing so that in 90 days maximum, I'm under contract. I'd love to see it in the first 2 weeks to 30 days. Really strategic pricing will get you there. The more you evolve this art form, you'll get there too. So with market conditions, I've got supply and demand. The second one is economic indicators. I need to understand the local employment. I need to understand the local development projects and economic growth. I need to understand the local economic condition as well as the national economic condition. What is happening to the pockets and the wallets of the buyers and the investors and the tenants that will impact this property? The more I understand that, the more I can fold that knowledge into my pricing strategy. Now I'm going to move into financing options. So once I've gone through market conditions, that supply and demand and economic indicators, now I go to financing options. This, my friends, is where we have the leverage of relationship. I'm going to bring Chris in from Launch Capital Markets, and he's going to be able to get me a great quote on a property so that I understand where interest rates are sitting at right now. And I understand the types of loan terms that the lending institutions around the nation are going to be willing to put on top of this. What I may need to do in financing options is look for, does the seller own the property free and clear? Would they have the freedom to put seller carried financing on top of this? That stuff's pretty sexy in today's market. It is in most markets, but right now that catches a buyer's attention. And that not only gets the seller maybe a slightly higher command in the purchase price, it also earns them revenue because they're going to earn off the interest that they carry on the note that they provide. Right. And as I keep looking at that, I'm gonna move into, could my financing options require a buyer to put more money down? What does SBA lending look like if they're going to be an owner user? What type of hard money or mezzanine financing might come to play? Do they hold debt that's assignable? Maybe they captured a screaming great rate and they've got another 2 years on that note that they could assign to a new buyer. I want to really look at all of the financing options available. And this means I have to get comfortable also asking the seller about the debt that they carry on the property, if any. Can you show me your note? Can I look at it so that I really thoroughly understand the terms of it? So the leverage of relationship is going to be me bringing in a great lender. I love a loan broker. Chris Wazell Launch is my go-to guy. And I also want to make sure that I'm comfortable having the conversation with the owner to look at their current note. And I'm looking at interest rates and loan terms. That's going to give me a real clear picture around the financing of what I can do to underwrite this property strategically. If you're not putting loan quotes inside your underwriting, I'm going to tell you right now, in any market, but especially downward facing where we've got gap between buyer and seller, that is a huge red flag for me that the broker is not in control of the deal. And that's a big red flag for most investors of this property is probably not well priced because we haven't taken debt into consideration. I had an agent I was talking with just earlier this week, and I asked him, have you looked at debt on this? And he goes, well, no, but the seller said they wanted 2 million, so we priced it 2 million. And the minute we looked at the debt, and I just ran his numbers real quick through like a simple calculator on my phone, I was able to see the buyer's gonna have to put 50 to 60% down to make this work. And he was like, oh, well, 50 to 60% down means on a $2 million deal, at a minimum, putting $1 million down. Most buyers aren't going to roll that out right now unless it's an exceptional opportunity, and this just wasn't. So you got to make sure that you understand the debt around the property. You have to have a relationship with that. That probably is the biggest brush in this toolkit around the artistry of my pricing that I'm going to swing, and I want you to swing that one too. Now we go into our last two, risk assessment. Risk is something that many times we don't think about, but an investment property has risk. Commercial assets have risk, and we've got to understand what that risk is so that we can responsibly deploy it inside our underwriting, but also communicate it to our seller and to the buyers. You've got to know the language and the conversation around this. The two areas I look at for risk is market risk. What is the potential change in the market that could happen while I'm on market with this property that I need my seller to be prepared to understand? Rate increases and decreases are a big part of the conversation. Everyone says there's going to be more decreases before the end of the year, but I actually think if economically we can't keep ourselves from defining what we're in as a true recession, they may inch rates up a tick more. We might see that before the end of the year in Q1. I'm hopeful that they bring them down, but that's a piece I got to make sure I'm talking to my sellers about. Listen, we're going to go out on the market at this price, but you and I are going to have a weekly conversation around what economically is happening that impacts this market so that we can keep in front of the market, not behind it. You never want to be chasing it. We're going to make sure our pricing strategy stays relevant based on the market that we're in. Does that sound fair, Mr. and Mrs. Seller? And they go, yeah, sure, that's great. You can use reporting tools. CoStar has some great dynamic reporting tools around market condition. Most comp narratives should give you some indication of, is the market moving like this or like this? And you need to understand what that risk creates there. Now, the other risk side is property specific risk. I'm here in Texas. Houston just had a hurricane that unexpectedly came through this past week. Natural impacts are risk. We need to think about environmental issues. You got to think about structural problems. If you go back up and you think about property condition, you say, that those sticks are not standing very much, like with much sturdiness. The property condition and structural problems could be a risk, right? Tenancy issues could be a risk. Development projects, neighboring, that might decrease the visibility and skyline on a property you're working could be a risk. So think about property specific risk as well. One of the biggest risks that I think we have to turn back to our financial understanding and look at is cost of insurance. Insurance has gone up astronomically for some properties, and in some market types with some product types, the insurance is like totally off. We're not touching it. States like Florida and California are having real issues with insurance. So you got to make sure you think about that property specific risk too. Is this property insurable? If it's not, I have to know that going into my pricing, and I have to think about that when determining my value. So when I think of risk assessment, I'm going to look at property specific risk as well as market risk. And that market risk is very economically tied to the national platform and stage as well. Lastly, my 10th one that I look at when I'm pricing a property is investment returns. Now, this is where I think a lot of agents kind of get it to a point, but if you haven't brought in a great lender and thought about the financing options, if you haven't done a deep dive on the income and the expenses, you're probably getting this one wrong. And it's why buyers aren't coming in on that property you thought was a hot, sexy listing. When I look at investment returns, I'm going to go for the first one, which is cap rate. Cap rate is across all investment types. That's going to be how I calculate the capitalization rate to understand the potential returns that come in on the property. But if I totally didn't do my job on collection of income and expenses, my cap rate is a hallucination. It's not real. And any buyer that actually digs into the property is going to quickly identify that and probably be turned off. So you've got to make sure that when you are developing your underwriting, you are thorough. You are not light-footed. You are going very heavily into the details and getting this correct at a very high level, because that cap rate has to be defendable. Think of it almost as in you're going into a panel and you've got to be able to defend that cap rate. The only way I can do that is with data and details that prove that my math is right. The next one is cash flow analysis. Again, if I don't have deep dive on my financials, deep dive on my financing options, I'm going to have a hard time getting a clear cash flow analysis. This is where we're projecting the future cash flows from a property. So if I haven't read the leases to understand what happens in year 3, 4, 5, 10, 20, then I can't give them a real number here. Again, it's a hallucination. I'm making it up. You got to be thorough on this. That cash flow analysis, being able to show what the future potential is, will help with defending the price today. But you've got to know what it is and know that it's real. Otherwise, you end up putting yourself into a condition where that cash flow analysis is maybe missing, right? And I've got to know what my debt looks like to truly know what their cash flow is going to look like. Otherwise, their debt may be more expensive than I thought it was, and it just won't be right. So these are our 10 topics that we've gone through. These are the moments where we look up and we say, okay, owner said they want 5 million. And now I'm going to come back to my drawing board and say, based on location analysis, is the 5 million a true value? Based on property type and use, is the 5 million a revalue? Based on financial performance, based on comparable sales, 555, remember, I've got to be able to defend it. Based on the tenant analysis, based on the physical condition, the market conditions, my financing options, is 5 million real? And then lastly, I'm going to go based on the risk that this property in the market creates. Is it real? And can I defend the investment returns that I am saying this property creates are real? Until I've done my homework, until I've really gone into the weeds on a property, my pricing is just a number. It's not a strategy. It's not something that I can say I've really gotten clarity on it. Maybe the owner said they want 5 million, but as a broker, I know my job is to go through these 10 conversations around the property and to come back and say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, it's actually worth 4.7, but let me tell you why we're going to get under contract in 30 days at that price. And if we price it correctly at 4.7 versus going out to the market at 5, we ideally can create a competitive bidding environment. It'll bring multiple buyers to the table, which will help us get you the highest net dollar in the shortest amount of time with the easiest process.